Sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen in the most ordinary places. What started as a routine winter training exercise in the remote mountains of Colorado would become a story that defied all odds and changed 3 lives forever. When Navy SEAL Marcus Rivera spotted something unusual in the pristine white snow during a solo reconnaissance mission, he had no idea he was about to stumble upon a scene that would test everything he'd learned about survival, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a handler and her canine partner. This isn't just another rescue story. This is about what happens when training meets instinct, when protocol clashes with humanity, and when split-second decisions determine who lives and who doesn't. What Marcus discovered that freezing February morning would challenge everything he thought he knew about courage, and what happened next would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate situations. The story you're about to read is true. The names have been changed to protect those involved, but every detail, every emotion, and every heart-stopping moment actually happened. This is the story of how a routine mission became a race against time, and how 3 strangers became bound together by circumstances that none of them could have ever imagined. The morning air cut through Marcus Rivera's lungs like shards of ice as he moved silently through the Colorado wilderness. At 28, he had completed 3 tours with SEAL Team 6, but nothing had prepared him for the bone-chilling cold of this February training exercise. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots as he navigated the steep terrain, his breath creating small clouds that disappeared quickly in the dry mountain air. Marcus had volunteered for this solo reconnaissance mission, partly because he enjoyed the solitude, and partly because he wanted to prove to himself that he could still handle the mental challenges that came with extended isolation. The exercise was designed to simulate real-world conditions, where a SEAL might need to operate alone behind enemy lines for days or even weeks. He carried minimal supplies, just enough food and water for 3 days, along with his standard gear and emergency equipment. The landscape around him was breathtaking in its harsh beauty. Towering pine trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with fresh snow that had fallen during the night. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarked by clouds, and the sun reflected off the white ground with an intensity that forced Marcus to keep his protective eyewear firmly in place. Despite the stunning scenery, he remained focused on his mission objectives, constantly scanning the area for potential threats and noting strategic positions. As he crested a small ridge, Marcus paused to check his GPS coordinates and take a sip from his insulated water bottle. According to his calculations, he was approximately 15 miles from the base camp and right on schedule. The plan was to reach a designated checkpoint by noon, establish a temporary observation post, and then radio in his status before continuing to the next waypoint. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. That's when he saw something that made him freeze in place. About 200 yards down the slope, partially hidden by a cluster of snow-covered boulders, Marcus spotted what appeared to be fabric. At first glance, it looked like it might be camping gear that had been abandoned or lost by hikers. But something about the scene didn't feel right. The fabric wasn't moving in the wind like you would expect from loose material, and there seemed to be an unnatural stillness to the area that triggered his combat instincts. Marcus immediately dropped into a crouch and pulled out his binoculars. What he saw through the lenses made his blood run cold. The fabric wasn't camping gear at all. It was a military uniform, and it was attached to a person who wasn't moving. Even more shocking, lying motionless next to the figure was what appeared to be a large dog, also wearing some kind of tactical gear. His mind raced through the possibilities. This was supposed to be a restricted training area with no civilian access, but it was possible that other military units were conducting exercises in the region. However, something about the scene suggested that whoever these people were, they were in serious trouble. The complete lack of movement from either the person or the dog, combined with the isolated location, indicated a potential medical emergency. Marcus knew he had to investigate, but his training also told him to approach with extreme caution. He couldn't see any obvious signs of what might have caused the situation, which meant there could be hidden dangers in the area. He carefully plotted an approach route that would allow him to observe the scene from multiple angles before making direct contact. Moving with the practiced stealth that had kept him alive in some of the world's most dangerous places, Marcus began his descent down the slope. He stayed low, using the natural terrain features for concealment, and stopped frequently to scan the surrounding area for any signs of threat. The snow was deeper here, reaching almost to his knees in some places, which made silent movement more challenging but also provided additional cover. As he got closer, more details became visible. The person appeared to be wearing the uniform of a military police officer, and the dog was definitely a working canine, based on the specialized harness and equipment visible even from a distance. Both appeared to be unconscious or worse, and Marcus could see what looked like rope or cord around their limbs, suggesting they had been restrained. The implications of this discovery hit Marcus like a physical blow. If these were military personnel who had been attacked and left for dead in this remote location, it meant there were hostile forces operating in what was supposed to be a secure area. It also meant that time was critical, because exposure to these temperatures for an extended period would be fatal, especially for victims who couldn't move to generate body heat. Marcus reached a position about 50 yards from the victims and took another careful look through his binoculars. The female officer appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark hair visible beneath her military cap. Her face was pale, and he couldn't detect any obvious signs of breathing from his position. The canine was a large German shepherd, and like his handler, showed no signs of movement or consciousness. What struck Marcus as particularly disturbing was the methodical nature of how they had been restrained. This wasn't a random attack or accident. Someone had deliberately bound both the officer and her dog, and left them in this isolated location to die from exposure. The cold calculation required for such an act suggested that this was either the work of someone with military training or someone who had intimate knowledge of the area and its conditions. Marcus faced a critical decision. Protocol dictated that he should radio in his discovery and wait for backup before approaching what could potentially be a crime scene. However, if there was any chance that either victim was still alive, every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death. The sub-zero temperatures meant that hypothermia would set in quickly, and prolonged exposure would cause irreversible damage even if the victim survived. He made his choice based on the same instincts that had guided him through countless combat situations. Human life took priority over everything else, including protocol and personal safety. Marcus keyed his radio and transmitted a brief coded message to base camp reporting the discovery of 2 downed personnel requiring immediate medical evacuation. He provided GPS coordinates and requested emergency medical support, but he didn't wait for acknowledgement before moving forward. The final approach required Marcus to cross an open area where he would be completely exposed if there were hostiles in the vicinity. He sprinted across the clearing in a low crouch, his rifle ready, constantly scanning for threats. When he reached the victims without incident, he immediately began assessing their condition while maintaining awareness of his surroundings. The female officer was alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin had the waxy appearance that indicated severe hypothermia. Her lips and fingernails showed signs of cyanosis, meaning her circulation was severely compromised. She had been bound with military-grade zip ties that had cut into her wrists and ankles, and there were signs that she had struggled against the restraints before losing consciousness. The canine was also alive but in equally critical condition. The dog's breathing was even more labored than his handler's, and his body temperature felt dangerously low, even through his thick fur. Someone had bound the dog's legs and muzzle with the same type of restraints used on the officer, preventing the animal from helping his handler or seeking shelter. Marcus immediately began emergency treatment procedures. He cut the restraints from both victims using his tactical knife, noting that the zip ties had been applied tightly enough to restrict circulation. He checked for other injuries and found evidence of blunt force trauma on both the officer and the dog, suggesting they had been knocked unconscious before being restrained and abandoned. Working quickly but carefully, Marcus began the process of warming both victims. He activated chemical heat packs from his emergency supplies and placed them at key points on their bodies to help raise their core temperatures. He wrapped both the officer and her canine in his emergency blankets, creating a shared space that would help them warm each other while conserving the limited heat generated by the warming packs. The officer's identification tags revealed her name as Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a military police officer attached to the 720th Military Police Battalion. According to her records, she was 29 years old and had been in the service for 8 years. Her canine partner was named Rex, a 5-year-old German shepherd who had been trained in explosive detection and patrol work. As Marcus worked to stabilize both victims, he tried to piece together what might have happened to them. Based on their equipment and location, it appeared that Lieutenant Chen and Rex had been conducting some type of security patrol when they encountered whoever was responsible for their current condition. The fact that they had been deliberately restrained rather than simply left where they fell suggested that their attackers had wanted them to suffer a slow death from exposure. The more Marcus thought about the situation, the more concerned he became about the security implications. If hostile forces were operating in this area with enough capability to overcome a trained military police officer and her K-9, they represented a significant threat to the ongoing training exercise and potentially to national security. The methodical nature of the attack suggested professional training and advanced knowledge of the area. Lieutenant Chen began showing signs of consciousness as her body temperature started to rise. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made soft moaning sounds that indicated she was experiencing the painful process of rewarming. Marcus spoke to her in calm, reassuring tones, explaining who he was and that help was on the way. He knew that hypothermia victims could become confused and disoriented as they regained consciousness, so it was important to keep her calm and prevent her from moving around too much. Rex also began to stir as the warming process took effect. The dog's eyes opened and he tried to lift his head, but his movements were weak and uncoordinated. Marcus gently stroked the animal's head and spoke softly to him, using the calm, confident tone that he knew would be reassuring to a working dog. Rex seemed to understand that Marcus was trying to help, and the dog relaxed slightly under his touch. As both victims became more alert, Marcus was able to gather some initial information about what had happened to them. Lieutenant Chen's speech was slurred and difficult to understand due to the effects of hypothermia, but she managed to communicate that she and Rex had been conducting a routine security patrol when they encountered 3 men in civilian clothing who claimed to be lost hikers. The men had approached them asking for directions, and Lieutenant Chen had stopped to assist them as part of her standard community relations protocols. However, something about their behavior had seemed off to her, and she had begun to become suspicious when they started asking detailed questions about military operations in the area. When she attempted to radio in their encounter, one of the men had struck her from behind with what felt like a heavy object, knocking her unconscious. Rex had immediately moved to defend his handler, but the attackers had been prepared for this possibility. They had used some type of device, possibly a stun gun or similar weapon, to incapacitate the dog before he could reach them. Lieutenant Chen's last memory before losing consciousness was seeing Rex collapse beside her and hearing the men discussing what to do with both of them. This information confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the nature of the attack. The fact that the attackers had been asking questions about military operations suggested they were engaged in intelligence gathering, possibly for hostile foreign interests or domestic terrorist organizations. Their ability to quickly and efficiently neutralize both a trained officer and her K9 indicated professional training and advanced planning. Marcus radioed an updated report to base camp, providing the new intelligence about the attackers and emphasizing the potential security threat they represented. He requested that security forces be dispatched to begin searching the area immediately, as the attackers might still be in the vicinity. He also stressed the urgent need for medical evacuation, as both victims required immediate hospital treatment to prevent permanent damage from their exposure to the extreme cold. The response from base camp was swift and comprehensive. A medical evacuation helicopter was already en route, along with a full security team to begin investigating the incident. Marcus was ordered to maintain his position with the victims until help arrived, but to be prepared to move to an alternate location if the tactical situation changed. As they waited for rescue, Marcus continued monitoring the condition of both Lieutenant Chen and Rex. The warming process was progressing well, and both victims were becoming more alert and responsive. However, he knew that hypothermia victims could experience dangerous complications even after their body temperature began to return to normal, so constant vigilance was required. Lieutenant Chen was able to provide additional details about her attackers as her mental clarity improved. She described them as 3 men, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, with military-style haircuts and physical conditioning that suggested combat training. They had been wearing civilian outdoor clothing, but their equipment and the coordinated nature of their attack indicated professional capabilities. Most significantly, Lieutenant Chen remembered that one of the attackers had spoken with what sounded like a foreign accent, possibly Eastern European. This detail added another layer of concern to the situation, as it suggested possible involvement by foreign intelligence services or international criminal organizations with ties to hostile nations. Rex had also recovered enough to be more responsive to Marcus's attempts at communication. The dog was clearly experiencing discomfort from the rewarming process, but his vital signs were stabilizing, and he was beginning to show more normal behaviors. Most importantly, Rex was staying close to his handler and seemed to understand that Marcus was helping both of them. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors finally broke the mountain silence, signaling that professional medical help was about to arrive. Marcus popped a smoke grenade to mark their location and began preparing both victims for transport. He knew that the next few hours would be critical in determining whether Lieutenant Chen and Rex would make a full recovery from their ordeal. As the medical evacuation helicopter settled into a clearing about 100 yards away, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led him to discover the 2 victims. If he had taken a slightly different route or been running even a few minutes behind schedule, he might never have spotted them at all. In that case, both Lieutenant Chen and Rex would almost certainly have died from exposure before anyone else found them. The medical team that approached their position was equipped with specialized equipment for treating hypothermia victims, and they immediately took over the care of both patients. Marcus provided them with a detailed briefing on the victim's condition and the treatment he had administered, as well as the intelligence he had gathered about the attack. As Lieutenant Chen and Rex were loaded onto stretchers for transport to the helicopter, she managed to grab Marcus's hand and whisper a weak but heartfelt thank you. Rex, despite his weakened condition, seemed to understand what was happening and gave Marcus's hand a gentle lick before being carried away by the medical team. Marcus watched the helicopter disappear into the clear blue sky, carrying the two victims toward the medical care they desperately needed. But he knew that this was only the beginning of what would likely become a complex investigation into a security breach, with potentially serious national security implications. The three attackers were still at large, and their true motives and affiliations remained unknown. As he gathered his gear and prepared to continue his mission under new orders from base camp, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He had no way of knowing that his decision to risk his own safety to save two strangers would set in motion a series of events that would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and the bonds that form between people who have shared life and death experiences. The mountain wilderness around him looked exactly the same as it had when he first spotted the victims, but Marcus knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. He had witnessed something that challenged his understanding of the threats facing his country, and he had formed a connection with two fellow service members that would prove to be stronger and more lasting than any of them could have anticipated in those desperate moments in the snow. 3 days after the rescue, Marcus found himself in a sterile conference room at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center, staring at intelligence photographs that made his stomach turn. The images showed the scene where he had found Lieutenant Chen and Rex, but they had been taken from angles that revealed details he hadn't noticed during the emergency. The precision of the attack, the calculated positioning of the victims, and the evidence of surveillance equipment that had been hastily removed all pointed to a level of sophistication that went far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Colonel James Morrison, the intelligence officer leading the investigation, spread additional photographs across the table, with the methodical precision of someone who had delivered bad news many times before. His weathered face bore the kind of lines that came from decades of dealing with threats to national security, and his grey eyes held Marcus's attention with an intensity that suggested this briefing was going to change everything he thought he knew about what had happened in those mountains. "What you stumbled onto wasn't a random attack, Rivera," Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of classified information that few people would ever be authorized to hear. Lieutenant Chen and her K-9 were targeted specifically because of an investigation she had been conducting into suspicious activities at several military installations across the region. Someone wanted her silenced, and they came very close to succeeding.
Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the medical center.
During his 3 days of debriefings following the rescue, he had provided detailed accounts of everything he had observed, but no one had mentioned that Lieutenant Chen might have been involved in anything more sensitive than routine security patrols. The revelation that she had been conducting an active investigation added an entirely new dimension to what had happened, and it explained the professional nature of the attack against her. The colonel continued his briefing by explaining that Lieutenant Chen had been working undercover for the past 6 months, investigating reports of unauthorized personnel gaining access to restricted areas at multiple military facilities. Her cover story as a routine military police officer conducting security patrols had allowed her to move freely between different installations while gathering intelligence on what appeared to be a coordinated effort to compromise military security. Her investigation had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated network that included both foreign operatives and domestic collaborators with access to classified information about military operations and training schedules. The network appeared to be focused on gathering intelligence about special operations training programs, weapons testing, and strategic planning processes that could be valuable to hostile foreign governments or terrorist organizations. Rex had been more than just a K-9 partner in this operation. The dog had been specially trained to detect electronic surveillance equipment, and his keen senses had helped Lieutenant Chen identify several hidden cameras and listening devices that had been planted in supposedly secure areas. The partnership between the officer and her dog had been so effective that they had gotten close enough to the truth to become a direct threat to the entire operation. The 3 men who attacked them weren't random criminals, Colonel Morrison explained, pointing to enhanced photographs that showed partial license plate numbers and footprint analysis from the scene. "We've identified 2 of them through facial recognition software and intelligence databases. They're contract operatives with ties to a foreign intelligence service that has been particularly aggressive in their attempts to penetrate American military security in recent years." The photographs showed 2 men in their late 30s both with military backgrounds and records of working for private security contractors that were known to have connections with hostile foreign governments. Their presence in Colorado during the same time frame as the attack on Lieutenant Chen was too much of a coincidence to be anything other than a planned operation designed to eliminate her before she could complete her investigation. Marcus studied the intelligence photographs with growing concern about the implications of what he was learning. If Lieutenant Chen had been close enough to exposing this network to warrant such a drastic response, it meant that the security breach was much more serious than anyone had initially realized. It also meant that there were probably other operatives still active in the area who represented an ongoing threat to military personnel and operations. "What's the current status of Lieutenant Chen and Rex?" Marcus asked, realizing that he had been so focused on the intelligence briefing that he hadn't received any updates on their medical condition since the day of the rescue. He had been thinking about both of them constantly during his own debriefings, wondering whether they had recovered from their hypothermia and what kind of long-term effects they might experience from their ordeal. Colonel Morrison's expression softened slightly as he responded to Marcus's question. "They're both doing remarkably well considering what they went through. Lieutenant Chen spent 2 days in intensive care being treated for severe hypothermia and dehydration, but she's expected to make a full recovery. Rex required surgery to repair some internal injuries from the attack, but the veterinary team says he should be back to full duty within a few weeks." The relief that washed over Marcus was more intense than he had expected. During the long hours of debriefings and intelligence analysis, he had tried to maintain professional detachment from the 2 victims he had rescued, but hearing that both Lieutenant Chen and Rex were going to recover completely brought home just how emotionally invested he had become in their welfare. The bond that had formed during those critical moments in the snow was stronger than he had realized. "There's something else you need to know," Colonel Morrison continued, his tone becoming more serious again. "Lieutenant Chen has been asking to speak with you ever since she regained full consciousness. She says she has information about the attack that she can only share with the person who saved her life. She doesn't trust anyone else at this point, and frankly, given what we've learned about the extent of this security breach, her caution is probably justified." This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Marcus understood that Lieutenant Chen's reluctance to trust anyone other than him was based on more than just gratitude for her rescue. If she had been investigating a network that included people with access to classified information and military facilities, she couldn't be certain who might be compromised and who could be trusted with sensitive intelligence. The colonel explained that Lieutenant Chen's request to speak privately with Marcus had created some procedural challenges for the investigation team. Normally, all intelligence debriefings would be conducted by trained interrogators with appropriate security clearances and recording equipment to ensure that no critical information was lost or misinterpreted. However, Lieutenant Chen's insistence that she would only share certain details with Marcus meant that alternative arrangements would have to be made. "We're going to set up a meeting between you and Lieutenant Chen this afternoon," Colonel Morrison said. "You'll be accompanied by one of our intelligence analysts and the conversation will be recorded for security purposes, but she'll be able to speak directly with you about whatever information she feels comfortable sharing. We need to respect her wishes while still maintaining proper investigative protocols." Marcus agreed to the meeting, though he felt somewhat apprehensive about taking on what amounted to an intelligence-gathering role for which he had no specific training. His expertise was in direct action operations and small unit tactics, not in the subtle art of extracting sensitive information from reluctant sources. However, he understood that Lieutenant Chen's trust was a valuable asset that couldn't be replicated through normal intelligence procedures. The afternoon meeting took place in a secure conference room at the medical center, with Lieutenant Chen looking remarkably well considering what she had been through just 3 days earlier. She was dressed in civilian clothes rather than her military uniform, and Marcus noticed that her hands still showed some signs of frostbite damage from her time bound in the snow. Despite her physical condition, her eyes were sharp and alert, and she greeted Marcus with a warmth that went beyond simple gratitude. Rex was also present for the meeting, lying at Lieutenant Chen's feet, and occasionally lifting his head to look around the room with the alert attention of a working dog who was still on duty. The German Shepherd showed no obvious signs of his ordeal other than some bandaging around his midsection where he had undergone surgery to repair internal injuries from the attack. His presence seemed to give Lieutenant Chen additional confidence, and Marcus could see the strong bond between the officer and her canine partner. "I need to start by thanking you for what you did," Lieutenant Chen began, her voice still slightly hoarse from her medical ordeal. "The doctors told me that if you hadn't found us when you did, we wouldn't have survived another hour in those conditions. But more than that, I need you to understand that what happened to us wasn't random, and it's not over yet." She went on to explain details about her investigation. that went beyond what Colonel Morrison had shared in the morning briefing. Lieutenant Chen had discovered that the security breach involved not just unauthorized access to military facilities, but active sabotage of equipment and theft of classified documents related to special operations training programs. The network she had been investigating was preparing for what appeared to be a major operation that could compromise multiple military installations simultaneously. The three men who attacked us knew exactly who I was and what I was investigating, Lieutenant Chen continued, glancing nervously at the intelligence analyst who was taking notes during the conversation. They had been watching me for at least 2 weeks before they made their move, and they knew my patrol routes, my schedule, and even details about Rex's training and capabilities. Someone with access to classified information had been feeding them intelligence about my investigation. This revelation confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion that the security breach extended into the highest levels of military intelligence and operations security. The fact that the attackers had known so much detail about Lieutenant Chen's activities meant that someone with legitimate access to classified information was actively working against American military interests. The implications for ongoing operations and personnel security were staggering. Lieutenant Chen provided additional details about the attack itself that she hadn't been able to share during her initial medical debriefing. She explained that the three men had approached her with a sophisticated cover story about being researchers studying wildlife patterns in the area. Their knowledge of the local terrain and military training schedules had been detailed enough to initially allay her suspicions, which suggested extensive advanced preparation and inside information. They had equipment with them that looked like scientific instruments, but I realize now that it was probably electronic surveillance gear, she continued. They were asking questions about military training activities that seemed innocent enough individually, but taken together, they were trying to build a complete picture of our operational capabilities and vulnerabilities. Rex had been the first to sense that something was wrong about the encounter. The dog's behavior had become increasingly agitated as the conversation continued, and he had positioned himself between Lieutenant Chen and the three men in a way that indicated he perceived them as a threat. Lieutenant Chen had learned to trust her canine partner's instincts completely, and Rex's warning signals had caused her to become more cautious and start moving toward her radio to report the encounter. That's when they realized their cover wasn't working, Lieutenant Chen explained, unconsciously reaching down to stroke Rex's head as she recalled the traumatic events. The man who seemed to be their leader gave some kind of signal to the others, and before I could react, one of them hit me from behind with something heavy. The last thing I remember clearly was Rex trying to get to me before they used some kind of electronic weapon to incapacitate him. The description of the attack confirmed the professional nature of the operation and the level of planning that had gone into it. The attackers had been prepared for the possibility that Lieutenant Chen might become suspicious, and they had contingency plans for dealing with both her and her canine partner. The use of an electronic weapon against Rex suggested they had researched his training and capabilities and had come equipped with appropriate countermeasures. Marcus found himself becoming increasingly angry as he listened to Lieutenant Chen's account of the attack. The calculated nature of what had been done to her and Rex went beyond simple criminal activity or even routine espionage. The decision to leave them bound in sub-zero temperatures to die slowly from exposure demonstrated a level of cruelty that spoke to the character of the people they were dealing with. "There's something else," Lieutenant Chen said, lowering her voice even though they were in a secure environment. "During the few minutes when I was drifting in and out of consciousness after they tied us up, I heard them talking about their next targets. They mentioned specific names and locations that are part of ongoing military operations. If they're still out there, other people are in immediate danger." She provided Marcus and the intelligence analyst with the names and details she had overheard.
Information that caused the analyst to immediately excuse himself to make urgent phone calls to warn the potential targets.
The fact that Lieutenant Chen had retained such specific details despite her medical condition was a testament to her training and professionalism, but it also meant that the investigation had suddenly become much more urgent and complex. Marcus realized that his role in this situation was evolving beyond that of a simple rescuer who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. Lieutenant Chen's trust in him, combined with the sensitive nature of the information she was sharing, meant that he was now an integral part of an ongoing intelligence operation with potentially serious national security implications. "I need you to understand something," Lieutenant Chen said, looking directly at Marcus with an intensity that commanded his complete attention. "These people tried to kill Rex and me not just to stop our investigation, but to send a message to anyone else who might be getting close to the truth. They're not just stealing information. They're willing to commit murder to protect whatever operation they're planning, and they're still out there." The weight of this responsibility was something that Marcus felt deeply, even though his SEAL training had prepared him for high-stakes operations with life-or-death consequences. The difference was that this situation involved not just immediate tactical threats, but a complex web of intelligence operations that could affect the security of multiple military installations and the safety of hundreds of military personnel. Colonel Morrison returned to the conference room as Lieutenant Chen was finishing her detailed account of the information she had overheard from her attackers. His expression was grim, and Marcus could tell from his body language that the phone calls made by the intelligence analyst had confirmed some of their worst fears about the scope and timing of the threat they were facing. "We verified that 2 of the potential targets Lieutenant Chen overheard are currently involved in classified operations that would be severely compromised if hostile forces had advanced knowledge of their activities," the colonel explained. "We're implementing immediate security measures, but we need to assume that the people responsible for this attack have access to real-time intelligence about our response efforts." This meant that the investigation itself had to be conducted with the assumption that their adversaries might be aware of their progress and could be taking countermeasures to avoid detection or elimination. It also meant that Marcus, Lieutenant Chen, and Rex were likely still in danger, since their survival and cooperation with the investigation represented an ongoing threat to whatever operation was being planned by the hostile network. "What's our next move?" Marcus asked, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with transitioning from information gathering to operational planning. His SEAL training had taught him to focus on actionable intelligence and concrete steps that could be taken to neutralize threats and protect friendly forces. Colonel Morrison's response was both reassuring and concerning. The military was implementing a comprehensive security review of all personnel, with access to the information that had been compromised, and special protection details were being assigned to the potential targets that Lieutenant Chen had identified. However, the attackers remained at large, and their access to inside information meant that traditional security measures might not be sufficient to prevent them from completing whatever mission they had been assigned. "We're going to need your continued cooperation," Colonel Morrison told Marcus and Lieutenant Chen. "This investigation is going to require resources and expertise from multiple agencies, and your first-hand knowledge of these attackers and their capabilities is going to be crucial to our success in stopping them before they can complete their mission." Lieutenant Chen immediately agreed to provide whatever assistance was needed, despite the obvious risks involved in continuing to pursue people who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder. Rex seemed to sense the renewed tension in the room, and the German Shepherd moved closer to his handler in a protective posture that reminded everyone present of the courage and loyalty that had nearly cost both of them their lives. Marcus also agreed to remain involved in the investigation, though he understood that doing so would likely extend his assignment far beyond the original training exercise that had brought him to Colorado. The bonds that had been formed during those desperate moments in the snow had created obligations and relationships that went far beyond normal military duty assignments. As the meeting concluded, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. What had started as a routine training exercise had become a complex intelligence operation that could have far-reaching implications for national security. More personally, he had formed connections with Lieutenant Chen and Rex that he knew would last for the rest of his life, regardless of how the current crisis was ultimately resolved. The investigation was entering a new phase, one that would require all of them to take risks that went far beyond what anyone had originally signed up for. But Marcus also knew that the alternative, allowing the hostile network to complete whatever operation they were planning, was unacceptable. The same instincts that had driven him to risk his own safety to save 2 strangers in the snow were now compelling him to see this mission through to its conclusion, whatever the personal cost might be. 2 weeks after the mountain rescue, Marcus found himself crouched in the pre-dawn darkness outside a remote cabin in the Wyoming wilderness, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he waited for the signal to move. The intelligence gathered from Lieutenant Chen's debriefings had led to this moment, and everything they had learned about the hostile network was about to be put to the ultimate test. Beside him, Rex lay motionless in the snow, his dark eyes fixed on the cabin where the 3 men who had tried to kill him and his handler were believed to be preparing for their final operation. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of intelligence analysis, operational planning, and intensive preparation for what military planners were calling Operation Snow Guardian. The name had been chosen specifically to honor the circumstances under which the threat had been discovered, and Marcus felt a deep sense of personal investment in seeing this mission succeed. Lieutenant Chen was positioned with a surveillance team on the opposite side of the cabin, her expertise in the attacker's methods proving invaluable to the tactical planning process. The cabin had been identified through a combination of electronic surveillance, financial records analysis, and old-fashioned detective work that traced the attackers' movements through multiple states over several months. What they found was a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple espionage or information gathering. The hostile network had been preparing for a coordinated attack on multiple military installations that would have compromised critical national security assets and potentially cost hundreds of lives. Marcus checked his watch and confirmed that they were still on schedule for the simultaneous raids that were about to take place at 3 different locations across the western United States. The operation had been planned with the kind of precision that only came from combining military special operations expertise with intelligence community resources. But everyone involved understood that success was far from guaranteed. The enemy had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their mission, and they had access to inside information that could compromise any operation against them. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard the voice of the mission commander, confirming that all teams were in position and ready to execute. The plan was to simultaneously capture all known members of the network before they could communicate with each other or destroy evidence of their activities. Intelligence analysts had determined that the group was planning to execute their mission within the next 24 hours, which meant that timing was absolutely critical to preventing a potential national security disaster. Rex had been cleared for duty just 2 days earlier, and his presence on this mission was both practically valuable and emotionally significant for everyone involved. The German Shepherd's specialized training in detecting electronic surveillance equipment had already identified several hidden devices around the cabin that human searchers had missed, and his partnership with Lieutenant Chen had provided insights into the enemy's capabilities that wouldn't have been available through any other source. As the seconds ticked down to the execution time, Marcus felt the familiar combination of focused calm and heightened alertness that had carried him through countless combat operations during his SEAL career. But this mission felt different from anything he had experienced before, because it was so directly connected to people he had come to care about deeply during the most intense circumstances imaginable. The bonds forged during that desperate rescue in the Colorado mountains had created stakes that went far beyond professional duty or military objectives. The signal to move came as a series of coded clicks through his earpiece, and Marcus rose from his concealed position with the fluid motion of someone who had performed similar operations hundreds of times. Around him, other members of the assault team moved toward their assigned positions with the silent precision that marked them as elite military operators. Every aspect of their approach had been planned and rehearsed until it became instinctive, but everyone understood that the enemy inside the cabin was equally professional and equally dangerous. Rex moved alongside Marcus with the confidence of a working dog who understood exactly what was expected of him in this situation. The German Shepherd's recovery from his injuries had been remarkable, and his eagerness to participate in the mission seemed to reflect a desire for justice that went beyond simple training and conditioning. Lieutenant Chen had told Marcus that Rex had been unusually aggressive during training exercises since the attack, as if the dog understood that the people who had hurt him were still free and dangerous. The cabin was small and isolated, surrounded by dense pine forests that provided excellent concealment for the assault team, but also created multiple escape routes for anyone inside who might try to flee. Intelligence reports suggested that there were 3 men inside, the same 3 who had attacked Lieutenant Chen and Rex, along with electronic equipment and documents that would provide crucial evidence about the broader network and their planned operations. As Marcus reached his assigned position outside the cabin's main entrance, he could see warm light glowing through curtained windows and hear the faint sounds of activity inside. The intelligence team had been monitoring the location for 72 hours, and they were confident that all 3 targets were currently present. However, everyone involved in the operation understood that the enemy's access to inside information meant that they might be aware of the impending raid and prepared to resist or escape. The final countdown began with a series of hand signals passed between team members, each confirming that they were in position and ready to execute their assigned roles. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly as the moment of action approached, but his breathing remained steady and controlled. Years of training and combat experience had taught him to channel nervous energy into focused performance, and he knew that his teammates were experiencing the same combination of anticipation and professional calm. The assault began simultaneously from multiple directions, with explosive charges blowing open both the front and rear doors of the cabin, while team members smashed through windows to prevent anyone inside from escaping through alternative exits. Marcus was through the front door within seconds of the explosion, his rifle raised and ready as he scanned the interior for threats and targets. What he found inside was both exactly what he had expected and completely shocking at the same time. The 3 men were indeed present, but instead of the surprised and disorganized criminals he might have hoped to encounter, they were clearly prepared for the assault and had taken defensive positions that allowed them to engage the assault team immediately. The cabin's interior had been modified to provide cover and concealment, and the men were armed with military-grade weapons that suggested they had been planning for exactly this kind of confrontation. The firefight that followed was intense but brief, lasting less than 30 seconds from the initial breach to the final surrender. Marcus and his teammates had the advantages of superior numbers, better equipment, and more extensive training, but the enemy fought with the desperation of people who knew that capture meant the complete failure of a mission they had invested months or years in planning. The sound of gunfire echoed through the forest, punctuated by shouted commands and the crash of overturning furniture as the battle raged through the cavern's small rooms. Rex proved his value as both a tactical asset and a symbol of justice by locating and neutralizing a fourth enemy operative who had been hidden in a concealed basement room beneath the cabin. The German shepherd's keen senses detected the hidden man even through the chaos of the firefight, and his aggressive pursuit prevented what could have been a devastating surprise attack against the assault team. The sight of Rex confronting one of the men who had tried to kill him seemed to provide a sense of closure that went beyond the tactical success of the mission. When the shooting finally stopped, all 4 enemy operatives were in custody, and the assault team had secured a treasure trove of intelligence materials that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The cabin had been functioning as a communications center and planning facility for a network that included foreign intelligence operatives, domestic collaborators, and criminal organizations working together to compromise American military security. The materials seized during the raid would lead to additional arrests and the disruption of hostile activities across multiple states. Marcus found himself standing in the middle of the cabin's main room, surrounded by overturned furniture, scattered documents, and electronic equipment that represented months of hostile intelligence-gathering activities. The adrenaline of combat was beginning to fade, replaced by a profound sense of satisfaction that came from completing a mission that had such clear moral and strategic importance. But more than that, he felt a deep emotional connection to the success of this operation because of its personal significance for Lieutenant Chen and Rex. Lieutenant Chen entered the cabin as the security team was processing the captured operatives and gathering evidence. Her face showed a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal relief that Marcus understood completely. The people who had tried to kill her and her canine partner were finally in custody, and the investigation that had nearly cost them their lives was finally complete. But Marcus could see in her eyes that the experience had changed her in ways that would last long after the immediate crisis was resolved. "It's over," she said simply. But Marcus could hear the weight of everything that had happened in those 2 words. The investigation, the attack, the rescue, and now the successful conclusion of the operation represented a complete cycle that had transformed all of their lives in fundamental ways. The bonds that had been formed during those desperate moments in the snow had led to this moment of triumph. But Marcus knew that the relationships between them would continue long after the immediate mission was concluded. Rex seemed to understand that something significant had happened, and the German shepherd moved through the cabin with an alert, satisfied demeanor that suggested he recognized the scents and sounds of the men who had attacked him. The dog's presence during the operation had provided both practical benefits and symbolic importance, demonstrating that the partnership between handler and K9 could overcome even the most serious attempts to destroy it. The intelligence materials recovered from the cabin revealed the full scope of what the hostile network had been planning. Their intended target was a major joint military exercise that would have brought together special operations personnel from multiple services and allied nations. A successful attack on this exercise would have caused significant casualties and compromised operational security for ongoing missions around the world. The prevention of this attack represented a major victory for American national security interests. As the cleanup and evidence processing continued, Marcus had time to reflect on the extraordinary series of events that had brought him to this moment. What had started as a routine training exercise had become a complex intelligence operation that had tested everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the bonds between people who shared life and death experiences. The rescue in the snow had been just the beginning of a journey that had ultimately led to this successful conclusion. Colonel Morrison arrived at the scene as the last of the evidence was being catalogued, and the prisoners were being prepared for transport to secure facilities for interrogation. His expression showed the satisfaction of someone who had overseen a complex operation from planning to successful execution. But Marcus could also see the relief that came from knowing that a serious threat to national security had been neutralized. This operation couldn't have succeeded without the intelligence provided by Lieutenant Chen and the trust that all of you developed during the rescue, Colonel Morrison told the assembled team members. Sometimes the most important victories come from the connections we make with each other during the most difficult circumstances, and this operation proves that those connections can have strategic importance that goes far beyond personal relationships. The formal debriefings and after-action reports would take several more days to complete, but Marcus already understood that this mission would be remembered as one of the most successful intelligence operations in recent years. The combination of special operations tactics, intelligence analysis, and the unique insights provided by the original victims had created a template for dealing with similar threats in the future. More personally, Marcus knew that his relationship with Lieutenant Chen and Rex had evolved into something that would last for the rest of their lives. The shared experience of life-threatening danger, the trust that had developed during the investigation, and the successful conclusion of the operation had created bonds that went far beyond normal military relationships. They had become a team in the truest sense, and Marcus understood that they would always be available to support each other regardless of where their careers might take them. As the operational teams prepared to leave the cabin and return to their home bases, Lieutenant Chen approached Marcus for a private conversation.
Rex accompanied her, and the three of them stood together in the forest clearing where the mission had concluded, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the wilderness that had been the setting for so much drama and danger over the past few weeks.
I need you to know that what you did for us changed everything, Lieutenant Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of deep gratitude and genuine friendship.
Not just the rescue, though that saved our lives, but your willingness to stay involved and see this through to the end. You didn't have to do that, but you chose to, and it made all the difference in the world. Marcus found himself struggling to respond adequately to the depth of emotion in her words. His SEAL training had taught him to maintain professional detachment even in the most intense situations, but the experiences of the past few weeks had challenged that conditioning in ways that forced him to acknowledge the importance of personal connections, even in military operations. "We're a team," he said finally, reaching down to scratch Rex behind the ears in a gesture that had become natural during their time working together. "What happened to you happened to all of us, and we all had a responsibility to see it through to the end. That's what teammates do for each other." Rex seemed to understand that this conversation represented some kind of conclusion to their shared experience, and the German Shepherd moved closer to both humans in a gesture that seemed to confirm their bond as a permanent part of his understanding of the world. The partnership between Handler and K9 had been expanded to include Marcus in a way that honored all of their contributions to the successful completion of the mission. As they prepared to separate and return to their normal duties, all three understood that they had been part of something extraordinary that would influence the rest of their military careers. The rescue in the snow had led to an investigation that had prevented a major terrorist attack and resulted in the capture of a hostile intelligence network. But beyond the strategic importance of what they had accomplished, they had formed relationships that would provide support and friendship for years to come. The drive back to base gave Marcus time to process everything that had happened since that morning when he first spotted two figures in the snow, during what should have been a routine training exercise. The decision to risk his own safety to help two strangers had led to one of the most meaningful experiences of his military career, and it had taught him lessons about trust, loyalty, and courage that would influence every future mission he undertook. 6 months later, Marcus received orders transferring him to a new assignment that would allow him to work regularly with Lieutenant Chen and Rex as part of a specialized team focusing on counterintelligence operations. The success of Operation Snow Guardian had demonstrated the value of their unique partnership, and military planners wanted to build on that success by keeping them together for future missions. The three teammates had proven that sometimes the most important victories come not from following established procedures, but from the willingness to take personal risks for people who need help, and from the trust that develops between individuals who have shared life and death experiences. Their story became a model for building the kinds of relationships that make military units more effective and more resilient in the face of complex threats. For Marcus, the experience had transformed his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Technical skills and physical courage were important, but the willingness to form deep connections with teammates and to prioritize their welfare above personal safety was what separated truly great military personnel from those who were merely competent. The rescue in the snow had taught him that sometimes the most heroic actions are also the most human ones, and that the bonds formed during desperate circumstances can become the foundation for extraordinary achievements. Lieutenant Chen and Rex continued their partnership in counterintelligence operations, but their work was now informed by a deeper understanding of the threats they faced and the importance of the relationships that supported their mission. The attack that had nearly killed them had ultimately made them stronger and more effective, because it had connected them with someone whose skills and dedication complemented their own in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The three of them remained in regular contact throughout their military careers, and their friendship extended to their families and civilian lives as they all eventually transitioned from active duty. The bonds forged during those desperate moments in the Colorado snow had created relationships that lasted a lifetime, And their story became an inspiration for other military personnel facing similar challenges and opportunities. Years later, when Marcus was asked about the most important moment of his military career, he always returned to that morning when he spotted two figures in the snow and made the split-second decision to investigate, rather than continuing with his planned mission. That choice had led to everything else that followed, and it had taught him that sometimes the most significant victories come from the simplest acts of human decency and courage. The story of the SEAL who found an officer and her canine bound in the snow became a legend within military special operations communities, but for the three people who lived through it, it was simply the beginning of a friendship and partnership that proved the power of trust, loyalty, and the willingness to risk everything for the people who matter most.